Thai cannabis laws. A lot of people are in Thailand at the moment doing work in cannabis. A lot of people are coming here to start industries. A lot of people are coming here with dreams and desires. And there's going to be probably a lot of people here leaving with very little money. The issue is that there's a lot of opportunistic development happening in the cannabis industry, and there's a lot of issues that people need to confront if they're starting a business up in cannabis in Thailand. Next slide. Do I have the clicker? Oh my gosh, technology. All right. I need to tell you this. We're lawyers. Anything we do for free is not legal advice. Just wanted you to know that. Nothing for free. So the general information. If you need legal advice, you need to come and see us. So that's the first thing. Let's first talk about, and I've heard this forever, cannabis can't be legalized. It's illegal under the UN conventions, the various treaties. Well, tell me this. How does Canada and Uruguay legalize cannabis? Good questions, because the US is struggling with it, Europe's struggling with it, Germany's struggling with it at the moment. Switzerland's not struggling with it. Being Swiss, they just get on with things. So how do we do it? And this is the boring part of the presentation, but it's important to understand. People will talk about cannabis in Thailand like, oh guys, you know, we've imported 20 kilos of cannabis. Cannabis is in the same category, technically, methamphetamines, heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine. No difference at all. And it was interesting, we had conversations, I've had this conversation 3 or 4 or 5 times with people saying, hey, there's so much imported cannabis in Thailand. Wow. And I said, have you ever done the maths? If I'm going to go to jail for 5 to 10 years and I've got to bring in cannabis, I'm going to have to bring in a freaking container load of cannabis versus a box of heroin or cocaine. Why am I going to do that? So I think these people are getting confused with what people use as marketing. That is, you go down to your little cannabis outlets and they say, wow, this is craft bud here, straight from the US. I think that's a marketing ploy. Yes, there probably is some imports. Yes, there are people carrying it in their bags coming in. And geez, I've heard people say you can send it through UPS or DHL. I smoke cigars. I can't get 10 cigars into this country without the customs guy calling me out. How are you going to bring in 50 kilos of cannabis? Come on, guys. That's not logical sense. What is logical, though, is what Thailand's done. Maybe they did it for real. Maybe they did it on purpose. Maybe they did it by accident. But the way the laws are set up in this country align with the way that Canada and Uruguay and parts of the US are applying the convention obligations. Now, Thailand signed a number of treaties, and the first one, which is the most important, is what's called a single convention. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in Asia going on. Singapore in particular says, come to Singapore with cannabis, you go to jail. You go to Hong Kong, come to Hong Kong with CBD, and you're going to do 5 years in jail, guys. So there's a lot of hypocrisy going on. But the simple fact is, and we'll talk about it, there is no reason why you can't legalize cannabis in certain areas, in certain ways in your country. So the official objective of decriminalized cannabis was to gain an early advantage over neighboring countries. Malaysia in particular is progressing with legalization of cannabis in various forms and fashions. So is Cambodia. Philippines is kicking it around. And other countries are not even interested, but Australia is looking at legalization as well. But they're there because they see there's a significant and profitable industry for health treatments and cannabis derivatives, and in particular, they focused on CBD. However, guys, that's all BS. The simple fact was 30% of the people sitting in Klong Prem up the road were sitting in there for cannabis. How else do you get them out? Decriminalize cannabis. They say, thank you very much. Cannabis is now decriminalized. Here's your cannabis back. Have a good day. Sorry about the 2 years you spent in jail, but you know, it's friends. It's okay. So that's what they did. I mean, ridiculous as it sounded, the prisoners released for selling cannabis were given back their cannabis. So that's the way it's happened. Look, the problem is that they brought in the law. They brought in a regime of tolerance of cannabis in the plant sense, but they didn't bring in the regulatory framework. Or, particularly, they didn't enforce the regulatory framework that they had. So, moving on. Come on. Here we go. So, single convention. Single convention is what it's all about. There's other couple of conventions. There's an 88 convention, there's a 77 convention, the 61 convention is the main one, the 88 convention, it's the UN convention. You can read it. It keeps thousands of people employed in Brussels and in Vienna looking at this stuff. But the basic thing is it talks about cannabis in the sense that the country's obliged to take punitive measures if they to restrict and contain cannabis use within the country. Part of the 61 convention was driven, most of it was driven by the US. And the US says cannabis was bad. Read, we can't control this, dude, so we're going to make it bad for everyone. So they criminalized and they mandated the criminalization of cannabis in that 61 convention. So it says that criminalization, and you can decriminalize, but can only be for personal activities, not for commercial activities. So it said basically, look, we're going to allow certain personal activities to be outside the convention so you can allow it to happen, and certain inside the convention which you can't allow to happen if you want to follow the convention rules. So what happens is there is a distinction between private and public use of cannabis. So what Thailand can do is basically decriminalize, technically it's depenalize, private use of cannabis. Not commercial, but the private use of cannabis. So that's an important distinction. The 61 convention has certain loopholes, and it's interesting, I got pinged by a couple of legal scholars that said, yeah, that's our theory as well. So I'm not a legal scholar, but it's good to see I'm on the same path as these learned colleagues. So what it says, it permits the possession of cannabis under legal authority. 36.1 says you have to penalize activity within the limits of your constitution, whatever you can do. And finally, 36 says parties can apply a specific health-centered alternate to conviction or punishment. So you've got a couple of outs there that are driven by this single convention. And what it is that the commentary, the most recent commentary says that if countries choose not to penalize for the possession and use of cannabis, then they can choose to do so, provided they take steps to maintain a provision that allows it to be used to the benefit of society. So you can't just say, do what you want. So you have to use it to the benefit of society. Keep that in mind, because all this comes to why we have cannabis laws as we do in Thailand. So the 88 convention, I'm not going to bore you with this. You can read the slides later. Basically adds certain requirements to the 61 convention. This is particularly important. 33.4.1 allows to provide alternate measures to the decriminalization of cannabis by providing education, treatment, aftercare, social reintegration of offenders, or other alternatives to conviction. So as a lawyer, you read that and it says it allows you to do a lot of things. And this is part of the word they use, decriminalization, is really based upon this article 3.4D. So, the driving factor of 61, if you want to look at the reason behind it, was to safeguard the health and welfare of humankind through two goals: the control of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, and B, prevention of the diversion of controlled substances into illegal channels. So the writing part of this is the health and welfare of mankind and the option to prohibit. So provided that the use and the maintenance of cannabis, the sale of cannabis, is within the grounds of health and welfare, then the convention allows you as an option to prohibit its use. So you don't have to say if you use cannabis you're going to go to jail. There's an option to prohibit the use. So what does that mean? It means that Thailand already had a regime in place to decriminalize cannabis, and it's called the Traditional Medicine Act. So the Traditional Medicine Act, and there's a long name to it, including the practice of the medical profession, traditional medical profession, allows the regulation of controlled herbs. Cannabis was, is, and remains defined as a controlled herb. So we have now a medical regime, traditional medical regime. We have a control mechanism, and ostensibly, if it's in the medical grounds, it's for the health and benefit of society. So we have a perfect regime to allow Thailand to say, yes, we can decriminalize cannabis. Countries like Canada and Uruguay, when they decriminalized, didn't have this regime. They had to put in place medical or pseudo-medical grounds for authorization of the use, and that's what they do in California. It's under our medical regime. So Thailand has this in place. So applying the convention, they can put cannabis under this Traditional Medical Act, and it's perfectly acceptable and legal, and they comply with their treaty obligations. So there's no need to change any of the treaties, the conventions that Thailand has signed up for, provided it's within this medical use authorization. So, general principles of treaty interpretation said you can't have one part saying you do one thing and another part saying you do another thing. So, if you let people use cannabis for certain reasons under the Traditional Medical Act, you have to let people grow cannabis. You can't have one without the other, it'd be ridiculous. So using that definition, you can work within the realms of the single convention, the Traditional Medical Act, and allowance to grow cannabis for medical, traditional medical purposes or Western medical purposes. So the part of this is the international obligations of Thailand, as they would be in many countries in Asia, can be easily satisfied by the application of their traditional medicine, or indeed any medical act that provides some limitations and control on the use of cannabis. So this interpretation is basically risk-free, and it requires very little changes to the law, simply removing cannabis from the list of prohibited substances, which Thailand did, basically threw it within this convention and the Traditional Medicine Act. So, what's happening now? Firstly, Thailand was one of the first countries in Southeast Asia to decriminalize cannabis. And that's important to understand that you can buy cannabis on the street, as everyone would have seen. There's probably more cannabis dispensaries in Bangkok than there are 7-Eleven outlets. There's certainly more than there are petrol stations. So it's everywhere. The simple fact is, cannabis in its natural form is legal. Remember, controlled herb. Once you process it, it's not a herb. So once it's unprocessed, it's perfectly legal. If you put it into a cookie, into an edible, if you refine it, technically, even if you grind it and use it in a joint, it is illegal because you've processed it and taken it away from its herbal form. I think the last one, grinding, is probably an extreme. But look, the simple fact is that edibles are completely off the table in terms of the legal regime. So what we have here is that, there's still a lot of up in the air. Nothing's been enforced. People are saying, you've got a law, what's happening about it? I think this quote from Kitty, who I've got a lot of respect for as one of the early pioneers, is pretty well right. Look, this is Thailand. On May 7, we've got an election. You've got a party supporting cannabis, and you've got a party using cannabis as a reason to gain votes. So you've got no one wanting to take any steps, including the police, including the regulatory authorities. So we're in a bit of a status quo until after the elections. And that's the reason you don't see enforcement. So the Thai government, regardless of what a lot of our friends in dispensaries think, has been perfectly consistent in its approach to cannabis. It is for medical use. Medical use under the Traditional Medicine Act, or if over 0.2% THC, It's classified as a drug and needs to be prescribed under the Western medical regime. So, herb, okay. Refined, not okay unless it's a drug and prescribed accordingly. And that's the way it is. They've been perfectly consistent on that. So when you talk about gummies, if a gummy has less than 0.2% THC, it's a CBD-derived gummy, that's probably okay. If it's over 0.2% THC, it's probably not okay. In fact, it's definitely not okay. So the government's been consistent. The law reverses a lot of penalties in that, and Thailand's basically done a great job to capitalize on decriminalization of cannabis as part of its tourism push. And the simple fact is that tourism is back in Thailand in a big way. It was at 1.5 million tourists last month. No one's being put off by the fact that cannabis is decriminalized in this country. So if, as some people said, this is all a bit of a social experiment, well, tick the box. Society's still here, tourists are still coming, nothing's ground to a halt. We don't see mad kids running up and down the street. We don't see people dying of overdoses, etc., although the media would tell you otherwise. There was as an aside, there was an interesting media, if you follow my blog space, there's an interesting media article about a couple of kids up in the Northeast who overdosed on THC gummies. Now, THC gummies are about 600 baht a gummy. The average income in the Northeast is less than 600 baht. So you're telling me they took their mum and dad's daily wage to buy some sweets? I don't think so. So there's a lot of these myths going around. So bottom line is, there is a rush to invest in cannabis. It is doing a lot of great things for the economy. Is it regulated? No. And we'll come to that in a minute. So, Thai government wants to work on it. We're talking about 88 Canatech. There's some sad stories about that. One of the founders has recently passed. Very, very sad to hear that. Great company. They do CBD up in the northeast. But you've got to be aware that cannabis in its current form will be regulated. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop having dispensaries on the street. But we will stop having them in the form and fashion they are now. So, the state of the grow in Thailand. The fact is, smoking of cannabis is allowable. The growth of cannabis is allowable within certain parameters. The Book Gansha app, everyone's talking about it. Everyone who grows says, I've got a Book Gansha app. Guys, I know you can't read Thai, but when you register, it says pending. No one's ever got an actual certificate from it. I'd like to see one. I personally put in 2 million plants and it said fine. So it's hardly an app that's well policed. What I believe it is an app where they're going to have a great list of people and locations they can knock on the door and say, where's your license? But other than providing personal use, it was never meant for anything more than registering for personal use. And that was limited to, depends on who you talk to, 8 to 12 plants. Anything over that's not personal use. And there's a regime in place for commercialization of that. It takes time. It takes costs. You have to meet certain requirements. People shortcut. And that's what I said. Cannabis will be around, but not in the way it is now. The other thing is smoking of cannabis. We've regulated it under some other acts, which is the Prevention of Smoking Act and the Health of Non-Smokers Act. So when you see people smoking on the street, that's actually breaking the law. It's not being policed, but there is a law that says if you smoke, whether it's cannabis or cigarettes or cigars, you have to do so within a regulated space. If you have a smoking room, there's certain requirements. It can't be seen from the street. It has to have a separate entrance. It has to be labeled as such. It has to have certain exhaust systems, etc. So if you follow the laws, there is a regulation and regime for doing a lot of the things that people are doing now. People just don't follow the law because it costs money. So, quick fact. Here we go. Why do we have so many cannabis outlets and why do we have so many growers? Well, the fact is, a kilo of recreational cannabis in US is about 6,000 baht. The same kilo in Thailand is 600,000 baht. So we can see the difference. I mean, you tell me, but my sources tell me a pound of quality cannabis in the US at the moment is between $5 and $7 US. Do the maths. So this is why you've got so many people rushing in the industry. The margins are huge compared to North America. So, controlled herbs, also as a controlled herb under the Thai Medical Act, can't be near temples, hospitals, can't be sold to pregnant women or children. One of the parties that wants to ban cannabis says, as part of its platform, we do not want cannabis sold near temples, schools, public buildings, pregnant women or children. Hey guys, it's already the law. You're not saying anything, just people aren't following it. So, okay. The export of cannabis, import and export of cannabis, when cannabis was decriminalized, there was a period of 5 years where import and import was limited to allow the local industry to develop. A fair law, and another reason why people bringing cannabis in are actually contravening what's a fairly clear law. And then finally, smoking is banned. We talked about that. It has to be in a separate place. We have some dispensaries near our building where I called the police. They had kids on the street buying and smoking in front of the dispensary. It's not what it's supposed to be about. So, okay, what's illegal under the convention is the import and export of THC and CBD other than for medical purposes. We know that. Legalization is plants only, so I'll repeat, it's not for edibles, it's not for tinctures, not for any processed product. Preparations of more than 0.2% are drugs, and they go under an FDA regime, which is completely different. The problem is, though, if you're setting up a business in Thailand, you've got to look at what happened in North America. We go through a couple of stages. We're at the stage, we're at the cowboy stage now, right? I call them the cannabis cowboys. And they're here, and they've bootstrapped themselves up, and they've got their operations running and they're making reasonable margins. What comes in? Regulation comes in. Regulation comes in, it says you can only buy from these growers, you can only sell if you record, you have to pay taxes, here's a regulation on certain strains you can grow and the strengths you can grow, so the price goes up. So the price goes up to 600-700 baht a gram. What happens is there's a section of the community that says, I don't want to do that. It goes underground. So there becomes an underground community selling for a third of the price, a quarter of the price, a tenth of the price. And what happens is there becomes an equilibrium where those who want to buy cheap, and those who want to buy legal spend more money. And what happens is the number of legal dispensaries drop because the margins drop as well. Those dispensaries which are servicing communities with low economic power go out of business because those guys say, I don't want to pay this price. I can buy it through, the black web, the dark web, or in Thailand online, or Lazada, or whatever. I can buy a lot cheaper. And that's what happens. The Canadian experience is as you regulate, you increase the price, you don't decrease the price. So that's another thing that we expect. The price points will either remain or increase as regulations increase. So, summary, all of that's there. You can grow it, you can sell it, you can smoke it. You can, the sales process is tightened up. We have stories of people selling through vending machines online being shut down. So all of that's starting to be tightened up. Medical practitioners, particularly Thai traditional medical practitioners, have never had it so good. Suddenly it's a profession that everyone wants to talk to because they're the ones who can prescribe under the Thai Traditional Medical Act. And they're becoming, sought after individuals to work in dispensaries or work with organizations that have multiple grow facilities. And import-export still under that restrictions, but there's ways to work around that. The other thing to be aware of is that we all focus on the sale of cannabis products, but there's a whole number of people. I was down in Phuket at a conference with the Hotels Association, and there's a huge industry for cannabis tourism, cannabis wellness, and people forget about that. They forget about it in the rush for the recreational side, but there is a tourism side which is doing very, very well, thank you very much. Some of the top 5-star and 6-star hotels are offering cannabis experiences for the family, and it's well looked after. So again, you know, we're finding some interesting things happening. What's next? Here's the crystal ball, and it really hasn't changed very much for 3 or 4 months because there hasn't been too much news on the new regulations. In fact, you heard the last reading, the third reading of the Thai Cannabis Bill was a couple of weeks ago before the election, and they didn't get a quorum, so they decided not to bother anymore. So there's going to be nothing until after the election. What do we have? Cannabis over 0.22% regulated. Cannabis will be taxed, and taxation will become the norm. We can see that happening. Low THC cannabis will be light touch. We know that's going to happen. Recreational use limited. Illegal dispensaries will be closed. If you don't have a license, you don't do the right track and trace, you're going to be closed. Growing will be regulated, and Thai nationals will be favoured. That was always going to be the case. Regulation is going to be under a couple of step processes, depending on how big your particular processing grow facility is. Large-scale growing of cannabis will move to oversupply. We know that. We're working with clients who've got 4,000, 5,000 square meter indoor grows, and that's coming online. So a lot of that will lead to initial oversupply. The expected regulation of the industry is going to sour. When I said cannabis tourism, we're talking about people coming here to get high. So it's going to sour that somewhat because the costs are going to be increased, and there's going to be a less, shall we say, less abundant choice of supply. But on the other hand, there will be supply, and there will be an increase in medical and wellness tourism. And Thailand will and continue to be a wellness destination where cannabis is part of a traditional regime for curative properties. So, 27 countries where cannabis is decriminalized, only 5 countries where it's legal. So that's an important distinction. And then only Canada and Uruguay really have moved to legalize recreational. And the other countries, and Thailand inclusive, have gone a half step forward. They haven't legalized recreational use. Okay, so bottom line, we can all guess about it, but until after the elections, nothing's going to be clear. We know the direction of the law. We know the direction of the regulations. We know what will probably happen. And when the act is passed, and both parties, no matter what they say, are both heading in the same direction, there'll be some more clearer standards to apply and clearer enforcement methodologies. So you've heard enough from me. We do have a few minutes for questions, I guess. Questions, right?